What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Thank God Pod. Okay, you guys, this week I am super excited to introduce a guest that I have actually wanted to have on here since I even first started thinking about doing a podcast. It's one of my mom's friends, but more than that, she has a super cool story about how she has grown in her relationship with the Lord, and I'm super excited for her to come on here today. But first, before I have her hop on here, I just wanted to give you guys a couple of life updates. First, I am wearing my coated sweatshirt, or my walk sweatshirt, right, which is part of the clothing brand that one of my best friends and I kind of built together. And I finally got myself a cream sweatshirt, you guys. For the longest time I only had black, so check it out. I'm like so excited. I don't know. I don't know why I never got a cream one. I just never did. So I finally got that in the bag, so I'm so excited. And I'm also on my second cup of coffee this morning. So if you know me personally, you know that it's like, okay, Allison, she's getting into that mode. She's ready to podcast is basically what that means. But I'm on my way back from the gym and I'm like, I better pick up another coffee. I've got to be enthusiastic. I've got to have some fun. So here I am. You can probably hear the ice. And of course, it's an iced latte always. I've been drinking cold brew in the morning, you guys. Absolute disaster. I can't drink cold brew. I vigorously shake. But anyway, that being said, I'm super excited to get into this episode with Lisa. Okay, everybody, this is Lisa. I am so excited to have you on the podcast, Lisa. We kind of have a crazy connection point. It's through my mom, but thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This is so fun.
Yes, I'm literally so excited, right? And thank God for using your mom.
Yeah, I know. It's the craziest story, and I would love to just start with that. Would you mind telling everyone kind of how we even got connected?
Yeah, so I started an Instagram account in late 2022. At that time, it was actually called The Sober Essayist. I've switched since, changed it to my name. But your mom followed, and she was a super follower, and we had she just liked and commented, and we chatted a little bit, and then this was basically the following summer. I was supposed to go to my cousin's wedding on a road trip with my husband, and we'll of course get into this more, but we're both sober alcoholics. I do not have any DUIs, but he does, and we realized 2 weeks before the wedding that he was not allowed in Canada.
Right.
So I'm like, what do I do? Should I fly there? Should I it's pretty, I live in Minneapolis, so Minneapolis to Toronto, I think, now I can't remember, it's 14 hours maybe or something. So
Okay, wow.
I had a few stops. I want to see some friends in Chicago I had already planned to visit. And so the Michigan stop was essentially the one I was missing. So I just posted on Instagram, my personal one too, just hey, do I have any friends from college who, live in Ann Arbor, Detroit, who I
Right.
could stay with? And in the end, I could have paid for a hotel and it would have been fine, but why pay for a hotel if you don't have to? And
Right.
clearly it was, it was God working, but I posted it on the Sober Essayist too. And your mom responded and was like, yeah, you can stay with me. I just have to ask my husband. And her husband gave her the okay. And I showed up at the door and the rest is history.
That is just wild, you guys. And for me, for my side of this story, I just get a random I think it might have been a screenshot from my mom, or she called me or something oh my gosh, the girl's post that I've sent you all the time, the sober essayist, blah 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 blah. She was so inspired by your stuff. And she just said to me, I feel like I'm supposed to slide up on this story of hers and offer her a place to stay. I don't even know if it's gonna happen, but it just really feels right. And to me, that was so out of the blue for my mom to say something like that. And that was, to me, just the Lord putting that, I don't know, desire on her heart, I guess, to kind of let you come in. But yeah, the rest is history. You guys ended up connecting at that point, and it was just the most random but exciting thing.
Yeah, it was so fun. Your mom also loves you so much. I
That's
heard lots
that's
about you.
sweet. I love her too. She's the best. Yeah, that's crazy. So this is how we got connected, everyone. Super random, but definitely a very God ordained thing. I know that Lisa, you've spoke into my mom's life so much, and she's been so encouraged by your work, but so have I. If you guys aren't familiar, Lisa's got an Instagram page. It's what is your handle again?
Now it's Dr. Lisa Stanton. It was originally the sober essayist, but through some prayer, I had it as the sober essayist because I wasn't ready to take ownership of it. My name was nowhere on there for the
Okay,
first
wow.
2 years. And then I switched it to my name, and it was a whole thing. I have a PhD in psychology, so it was this whole thing of, do I add the doctor? Do I not add the doctor? But because it's not
Okay.
about psychology, it's about God. But yeah, so Dr. Lisa Stanton, Dr. Lisa Stanton is the handle now.
Yes, and everything that you post is just so inspiring and relatable and real. And I think those are the types of people that I gravitate toward on social media, like people who are posting the real stuff, the authentic stuff, like this is kind of my story, this is what's going on, this is my this is what I've really struggled with. Like to me, that's how I like being connected with people is at like a vulnerable level, and you do such a great job of using your social media platform as something to share with people about like the real life scenarios, not just the highlight reels, which I think a lot of people take social media that way, you know?
Yeah. Most of it is like my low light reel and then how to work your way out of it with God.
Your low light reel, that's great. I love that terminology. That's so funny. So
Here's what I did wrong this week. Here's what I've been
right,
struggling with in my life, but
right.
here's the way out of it.
Right. That's so great though, because like that's the kind of like relatable content that I would argue people really need. I think a lot of times we go on social media and we just see everything and we're a little intimidated by how great everyone's lives look and how in our head it doesn't feel that way for ourselves. So I just like really applaud you for that because that takes vulnerability is a strength. It is not easy to just post what you feel is your like weakest moment straight online for anyone to kind of be an audience member to and just sit with it. Like that's a lot. So thank you for doing that. Like I love that so
Yeah.
much. But with that being said, something that I thought would be really cool for everyone to hear is just kind of your testimony, your story with how you started your relationship with the Lord and like what kind of led you there. So yeah, how did that all begin for you?
Yeah, I'm gonna start probably earlier than most people. I'm gonna start with my birth.
Yes, yeah.
But it's kind of relevant to like the my early relationship with God and then where it went away and then how it came back in the end. But because I think what's really wild, I also when I first like as a so the spoiler alert, I basically refined God at 30. But at 30, I like couldn't even remember. It turns out I did like go to church some growing up. Like more than some, but I couldn't even access that, which is so weird like what happens to your memories.
Yeah.
Like just by not having that relationship and like coming into this other sort of like direction of like agnosticism and the occult and all of these other places that I had ended
Right.
up. But so when I was really little, I can't remember obviously my first like 4 years of life, but around the time that I was four, my parents got divorced.
Okay.
And my mom has always been kind of like Unitarian, sort of like it's sort of nothing. Um, but what's interesting, she's become really open minded. She's actually my editor. She reads every essay that I write.
Oh,
Um,
that's so sweet.
yeah, and she always says like interesting perspective, right? So it's really cool that she's open-minded in that way. And my dad, when I was little, was Christian, and had actually converted my stepmom, who was a mathematician who had no relationship with God. And so I went to Episcopal churches, Presbyterian churches, a few others. I'm not really quite sure what they were. Um, Growing up, and I remember now having like this really childlike relationship with God back then.
Yeah.
And that what started to separate it even young was just like fear, like about random stuff, like why did the divorce happen? My garage
Right.
kept getting broken into as a kid, and I remember being like, God, why are you letting my garage get broken
Yeah.
into? This is crazy.
Aw.
And then harder stuff later on. So when I was in fifth grade, a kid who was in my class who I guess we were friends. It's so hard for me to remember because I've blocked so much of it out, but pretty good friends with him. And I had had a lot of trouble making friends early on. I think a lot of it was that like inward turned confusion, just
Right.
about like, why are my parents divorced? Why am I different? Why is this happening? But I was pretty good friends with this kid, John, and I was coming home from a ski trip with my mom, and she got a call from my school about a murder suicide. So his mom, who clearly had like mental stuff going on, had murdered him and then committed suicide.
Oh my
And
gosh.
that was like, yeah, I mean, especially as a fifth, I mean, even today that would obviously be hard, but as a
Right.
fifth grader, I just like shut down. Like they offered grief counseling. I didn't want it. I didn't like just
Right.
not interested in that. And then what's really weird is all around that same time. So my mom had gotten remarried to my stepdad, and his ex-wife died of alcoholism, like right around, or liver stuff, um, right around that time. And
Wow.
my dad had remarried, and they were trying to adopt kids. And my stepmom was a volunteer at hospice, and someone she was taking care of died of cancer. And we at the same time were like trying to adopt her daughter, so there was just like a lot of confusion, a lot of people dying. I didn't really get what was going on. Um, and that was kind of just like the big shutdown. And I don't even know, I don't have this moment of being like, God, I'm done with God. But I think I just sort of like drifted away from it of like,
Right.
there can't be a God if these
Right.
things are happening. And so I go through my teenage years, and that's like when I started drinking in my teen years. And then
Yeah.
I was like maybe going to church sometimes, but like extremely hungover. I've been drinking alcoholically since the day I started drinking. So at like 14, it was already bad.
Okay.
Um, I was drinking like at school in the bath, like drinking whiskey. We would go steal whiskey, and my dad lived like 2 blocks from school. We would just like go steal it from the house and bring it back to school and drink it in the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
um, I once actually, who knows if my dean of students will ever hear this podcast, but I'm like, I lied to you and I'm sorry. And I have confessed that lie at this point. But I drank a bunch of vodka before a soccer game, and not a soccer game where I was watching, but a soccer game where I was starting center midfielder,
Oh my
and was
gosh.
like, couldn't stand up on the field. It all ended with me claiming that I had food poisoning, and somehow I like don't get expelled, and which I don't even understand to this day how that happened. But yeah, so sorry, Dean Umble, that was actually alcohol. You were right. But
The confess it's time for confession.
yeah, it's time for the confession. But that's just like high school was just like drink, and I think that's when just like drinking and men kind of became my like main focuses. And I had this kind
Right.
of dichotomy in education. So like I got one B plus in ninth grade. I got all A's otherwise. Like I still remember Miss Quinn. I got a B plus in European civilization. Like
Mm,
I know what it was because I'm like
right.
such a perfectionist.
Yeah.
So high school was this like I'm getting all A's. I have 14 varsity letters, and there's only 12 seasons because I played two sports my junior and senior year in the spring. So
Yes.
like had the super high functioning perfectionism, or was like drinking, and those were like the two modes that I was in, or trying to like date people.
Yeah.
Um, and then I went to college on a like I went to run Division 1 track. I didn't actually have a scholarship for track. I had one of those, if you're familiar with that, like experience of I eventually got a merit scholarship I probably didn't really deserve, because the track coach argued for me to have one, even
Yes.
though it
Yep.
wasn't
Yeah.
like actual running scholarship.
Right.
Um, but the other interesting piece of that, and this whole like downfall of the thing that brings me back to God at 30, is like in retrospect, I got that scholarship because I had an eating disorder. So I had started to have a really bad eating disorder in high school. Part of that
Mm,
was an exercise compulsion. I was just running all the time because I like wanted to be skinny and lose weight, and then ended up getting this like
right.
scholarship as a result of that. So like
Right.
I'm now 19 years old, 18 years old, in college. I have been diagnosed with like 4 different eating disorders. I clearly have alcoholism, even though no one quite realizes that yet. Um, and actually, when I was really little, I had like a sticker phobia. I had OCD with light switches. So, like, so many things are happening that are clearly like I'm not living in joy. I'm not living in peace, right? There's a lot of problems.
Right.
And then in college, pretty soon I broke my leg, or I always say like my leg broke, and it was just like malnourishment and running too much, right? Like nothing
Right.
even hit it. It just broke. Um, and then the rest of college, I joined a sorority, like not a sorority where we were trying to focus. I mean, there was philanthropy events, but it was a sorority of like social drinking,
Right.
whatever.
Right.
And I spent the next 4 years basically doing that. I had a boyfriend the whole way through college. Bless him. His name is Robbie. He like stayed with me, even though I think he was pretty aware that he was dating someone who was like pretty mentally sick by that point.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really rough. So there was just a lot of fighting, mostly caused by me, maybe all caused by me. Or at least like what I was doing is what ended up causing the fight. In college, the rest of college, like, was just that dichotomy again of like, I think my GPA in college was like 3.92, like,
Mm-hmm.
or I was drinking all the time.
Right.
And that just like keeps being the story over and over again. So I graduate from college. I guess I should stop in my first like intervention
Right.
was my sorority sisters in college. We were gonna go to brunch or something, and then they put me in the car and we park in the Starbucks parking lot, and they're like, we called one of our dads who's in recovery, and he said like, we need to take you to a recovery meeting. And it was just like this moment um of like, I had so much fear. I had some relief because like I knew something was wrong the whole time. I had actually been
Right.
hospitalized for the first time because of drinking that February. So like it was clear that like the chips were starting to really fall.
Mm-hmm.
Um but I was just so embarrassed that I like almost, you like have this kind of like defensive, or I had this defensive
Right.
fight in me because I'm so embarrassed because these are my friends. And the defensiveness came out as me being like, but I was drinking with you yesterday and like it's your cocaine that I was using. You know what I mean? Like this
Right.
is you
Right.
guys.
Right. Right.
And they're like, we all talked and it's different when you do it. And there was just looking back, there was so much that was different for me than other people, that was worse for me than other people. When I just look at like, yes, it was drinking culture, but other
Right.
people weren't just like finding themselves like they didn't know where they woke up, like maybe like a few times, but like all the time, like every time I
Right.
drank I blacked out, every time I drank I caused a fight with my partner, right? Just like
Right.
I couldn't keep any promises, I didn't know where I'd be in the morning. So we go to this meeting. They convince me to go. I want to go really far away from campus. I don't know. Everyone I know drinks, so I don't know who I think I'm going to see in a
R-
recovery meeting near
Right.
campus.
Right.
But just in case someone else has an intervention this morning, I don't want to run into them.
Right. That's so fair.
It makes no sense. So we drive to this meeting, and I had what I know to be a pretty classic recovery experience now, which is that I walked in and I saw the differences and not the similarities. So I walk in, and it's, to me, I feel like they were like toothless farmers in their like mid 60s. It was probably like people who are 35 and like looked a little country, right? But I
Right.
was
Right.
in my most 21 or 22-year old like sorority self, and was just like, these are not my people. I'm not an alcoholic. I don't even know what that means. Like, I don't want any part
Right.
of this. Um, and luckily for me, looking back, like, I mean, I was so scared for that whole meeting and so confused and so overwhelmed by just everything that was going on. I don't even remember really what happened that day. But I know that they like never asked me to go back. And I don't know whether that's, I imagine, I used to think like, oh, they decided that I wasn't and they just were fine with it.
Yeah.
But I look back and I'm like, what would you do if you were my friend? Or what would I do if that was my friend? And they were like, I don't think this fits me. Like,
Right.
we're all 21 years old and we're like, like, I'm sure they wanted to say like, okay, but something's wrong that you need to fix, but they just like didn't have those words. And so they were just kind of like, okay, well, we tried.
Right.
Um, so I leave like that. I think I drank even like in the 2 days after that. Like it just wasn't my moment.
Right.
Um, Graduated. I remember like if you look at my graduation photos, I'm like so puffy from drinking. Like you can tell that by another month from that, it was just like back to where it had been.
Right.
Um, and then that fall, I moved to Minnesota. So I was born in Pennsylvania. I'd gone to college in Virginia. Um, and then I make the decision to go to graduate school in Minnesota,
Okay.
which is crazy because it was ranked, I don't know, like third or fourth or fifth in the country for a PhD at the time. That's why I
Wow.
went. Um, but my other two options were Duke and UC Santa Barbara. So like
Wow.
weather wise, I don't know, like it literally, I just had in my head that I like needed to go to this program, right? I think it was
Interesting.
God working in my life when I didn't even believe God existed.
God would.
Um,
That's so
yeah,
cool.
just knew that this is a path I needed to take. And so I end up in Minnesota, not knowing. So for those who don't know, Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes and also the land of 10,000 treatment centers. So just the whole like recovery life is really strong here. Not something that I yet was aware of when I was 22, but I moved here at 22 to start grad school. And that is for a PhD in social psychology. And my area of expertise is behavior change, which is wild
Wow.
because
Wow.
I literally, like, I knew that I had eating problems. I knew that I had drinking problems. And I knew that psychology was going to solve them. Like, that's
Right.
who solves these problems is
Right.
psychology. So
Quote
I'm going to
unquote.
become, yeah, quote unquote. Yeah, if you're listening, I have air quotes. Um, so it's psychology was going to solve those. And so I start that program, and over it takes 6 years to get a PhD. There's a terminal master's you can get in the middle, but there's really no point in having a master's if you're going to get a PhD. So I didn't. You have to write an extra paper, and I was too
No,
busy drinking,
got
so
it.
wasn't
Right.
going to do that.
Right.
um, no time for that. But yeah, so I moved here at 22, and then my whole 20s is basically like more of the same, is just progressing in this like life of like, once again, I get almost all A's. I do exactly what I need to do school wise. But I'm drinking whenever possible. My drinking was getting worse starting by the time I moved to grad school. Not just every significant other, but every like roommate I've had since then has always kind of had some type of drinking ultimatum, or you need help, or like
Okay.
we really need to
Interesting.
change what you're doing. So anyone who is really close to me has always known like something is wrong here, but like there's not really alcoholics in my family. I think a lot of the people I was interacting with, there's not really alcoholics in their family. So no one ever said go to treatment. They're just sort of like, can you not black out all the time? Like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. That's the
Right.
problem.
Right. Right.
I wish I knew what I was doing.
Right.
Um, yeah, so I move here, and then just continue this like kind of two-sided life. The thing that got really kind of weird or different about like the graduate school phase compared to college, I feel like I was just sort of drinking, living in, I don't know if I would call myself atheist or agnostic. It was just like God just wasn't even on my radar. I wasn't really rejecting God. I just like wasn't there. I do actually remember walking through when I was an athlete more, like the gym, they would have this Christian athletes meeting, and I remember just being like, what are they even doing in there? Like what are those people doing? Um, but like no thought of God other than like that's weird that there's some people who are Christian here. That was like as far as I got.
Wow.
Um, and my boyfriend in college wasn't he didn't I don't know what he smoked some weed and like had a little bit of like I don't know care about the world, but not we never really talked about God or not God or anything like that. It just wasn't
Right.
really on the table, which was different from the next 7 years. For most of kind of the middle portion of my 20s, I dated a guy who was like a big seeker. Um, not of God, but he wasn't really anti-God, but he was kind of that like new age. I write about this stuff some, but he was the one who introduced me to a lot of that like that new age thing where people like think that they're seeking God, but they're not seeking God. But
Right.
it's that like I knew that I was in pain. I knew that I had these problems, and I knew that life couldn't just be what it was.
Right.
And I like became a 200-hour certified yoga instructor in 2015. Like
Wow.
got really into like astrology and human design, and we had crystals everywhere. And like I can't even remember. I took a course to become like a psychic medium, like just really seeking in. And he has a lot of like astrologists around him. He owns like some big cannabis companies, and then kind of
Okay.
if you think of like the in Northern California, so it's sort of that like Northern California hippie
Right.
like seeker thing.
Yes.
um and so like that's kind of what, like I took mushrooms to try to have an spiritual experience, right? I took like a
Right.
lot of LSD because I thought that would produce a spiritual experience. So
Right.
what was different about those next years is I feel like I got to a point where I was like really starting to try to like find something. I was watching a lot of like, I don't know what it was called, like spirit science, it doesn't matter, but like I guess what's different about that phase is I started to realize there was something bigger, and I was trying really hard, and I was still stuck in eating disorder, and I'm still stuck in drinking, and I'm still stuck in these other things. But then I'm like trying to meditate, but not in the way that I meditate on scripture now. It was like
Right.
trying to meditate of like all of these different like meditation tactics and like
Right.
things to try to find joy, and like in infrared sauna all the time and red light and some of those things, like not any of the esoteric things. I still like to sauna, but like sauna is not God, right? Like there are
Right.
some
Right.
things that like are okay. So a lot of the things I just mentioned, like I actually don't think are okay to use at all anymore. But then
Right.
there's a few things that stuck around, like the red light and the sauna.
Right.
But those are like ways to stay healthy. They're not solutions for spiritual problems.
Right.
And I was like trying to use them as solutions for spiritual problems. If I just sauna enough, meditate enough, take enough cold plunges,
Right.
put my crystals out to charge in the new moon, that will somehow like solve the spiritual problems I didn't realize I had. So that's what got really weird about my 20s as I started trying really hard. And I actually wrote about this a couple of weeks ago, but I would have these experiences that I thought were spiritual experiences. And it's only in looking back now in my experiences with God that I can see that they were, my husband calls them like sensate experiences, like sensate pleasures. Like if those things didn't bring people pleasure, we wouldn't get stuck in them.
That's so interesting.
So like yeah, like those things brought these like semblances of peace, right? Like I think now of, I'm like still new to the Bible, so I try, but so like when the devil like brings Jesus over and is like, you can have all of this,
Yeah.
that it's like a lot of those experiences that I was trying was kind of like the devil being like, but look what you can have, right? Like you can have
Right.
all of these like yogis following you. You can have these like experiences of peace when you're like in this certain pose or when you're like doing this certain thing, but it's not like
Right.
the lasting peace and joy of God. It's sort of this like, it's just like getting high on a drug. Like it's this little
Right.
thing that lasts in the same way that like drugs made me feel better or I wouldn't have used them, but they're
Right.
not God, and they didn't they
Right.
didn't solve any of the deeper problems. So a lot of these like new age practices, they absolutely made me feel better in the short term. That's why I kept doing them,
Right. Right.
but they didn't solve the underlying problem. So I would
Mm,
inevitably like end up back in despair, back in bulimia, back in whatever
right.
thing I was doing.
Right.
But that's where I feel like the confusion got kind of greater. So that was most of my 20s. The other things that I feel like are relevant in my 20s where I start to like I had a lot more police interactions with my drunkenness because I wasn't on a campus anymore. I was just like out in
Right.
the world. I have no
Right.
arrests, no DUI. I deserve to have had arrests and DUIs, but I don't officially have any arrests or DUIs. Um, Police mostly just drove me home or sometimes asked for my phone number.
Wow.
Thank you, Chicago PD.
Wow.
Um,
Wow. What
so
an interest. Wow. That's so interesting to me.
I honestly think there's a couple things in my life today that I need to have a clean record for as God uses me. And I almost look
Yeah.
back and
Wow.
I'm like, that's why. Which is it's not like one of those things where it's like if God loved you when you were drinking, you'd have a clean record because my husband I think has 22 documented arrests and a pretty long history with like his record is the opposite of clean. And
Right.
like that's how God uses him is to show people that like that can be okay even with your record being like that.
Right.
So I just want to be clear because sometimes you listen to that and you're like, well then God must not love me because I have all of these arrests. And it's like, no, whatever it is,
Yeah.
God is going to use you. But there's certain things
Right.
that have come up in the way that God uses me now that I'm like, oh, I see why that's what that was.
Right.
Um,
Wow.
so no, I don't even like have a speeding ticket, which is nutty. I've been
I
pulled
even
over.
have those.
Yeah. I have them from like a camera, but never from an actual
Right. Right. Being pulled over.
human.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been pulled over drunk before. That's a whole other story, and like not gotten a DUI or even like a just disorder, that nothing, just sent on my way.
Wow. Wow.
Um, so there's like so many kind of weird things that were happening. But during my 20s, as I'm seeking in all of these like new age things and doing all of this, like having mushroom ceremonies or whatever, like all of this stuff, I'm also like my police interactions are increasing. I got to experience the inside of the psych ward at the Minneapolis hospital downtown because I was
Wow.
like in full psychosis on some drugs. Like just generally like going to the hospital because I drank too much alcohol type of thing. I like how
Right.
I like casually say that now. I'm like, well, just regular hospital visits too, and like regular people are not going on regular hospital visits
I mean,
because of
it's your
their
story.
drinking. Yeah, but it's just so funny to be at this point, and I'm like, oh, just like also when you drink too
Right.
much, you go to the
Right.
hospital. Like that's
Right.
what people do.
Right.
Um, so yeah, so that's like the weirdest thing, but I'm such like a suppressor. Like you've probably noticed even over this time, I'm still getting used to like sharing my feelings about things. Like I'm good at facts and
Right.
not so good at like, and then this is how I felt during that time, but I used to be way even worse about it. Actually, during my 20s, this is funny. I would go to psychologists all the time to try and get like new diagnoses to try and figure out what was wrong. So I got like depression, anxiety, social anxiety disorder, those things. But I had one diagnosis of something called alexithymia,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically like a complete inability to like process emotions or like understand them.
Wow. Wow.
Because she was like, you're just not getting it. Because I was attributing everything to like to outside stuff that was happening. Like I couldn't, if you said like, I don't know, like, are you mad about something? I would be like, I'm mad because this happened. It wasn't like I'm mad because I feel angry.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, it's
No,
like
it
if
totally
someone
makes
was like,
sense.
like your boyfriend cheated on you, are you mad? I'm like, well, I'm mad because he cheated on me. And like, yes, that experience probably often comes along with the experience of anger, but it's
Right.
not like, yes, right now I'm experiencing, like my heart racing and I'm flushed and I can't sleep well and all of like the
Right.
things that are the actual emotion. I would just like tell you the fact.
Right.
And it's just because I'm a professional at suppressing.
Wow. But that's so
So
relatable for so many people too. Like I feel like that's what the world tries to teach is suppressing emotion and not sharing that. Like isolating
yeah,
and suppression. So that's so relatable.
yeah. So that was just like life, right? It's just like suppress the emotion, move on to the next thing. And the thing that was really difficult about that suppression though, and that if someone's listening they might relate to this too, is it makes it really hard to be compassionate with other people for real, because
Wow.
I'm so used to suppressing mine that if you say I'm sad, I don't think to myself like, wow, Allison is like experiencing this like heavy feeling and needs support. I'm like, what happened? Why?
Right.
Because like sad is a fact that follows a something. It's
Right.
not like a feeling that like you want support for. So I was like not a very supportive person in some ways because of my own suppression, because I couldn't understand when other people were talking about their experience of emotion, what they were even talking about.
Wow. Wow, that's so profound.
Yeah. So I've like gone back. I mean, part of my amends to a lot of my friends was just like, I'm sorry for not even realizing like how to be a friend. I just wasn't even, it just wasn't, I wasn't getting it. And
Right.
of course, that's only escalated with like the boyfriends that I had over those periods of time. Like, imagine being my boyfriend at the time and you say you're hurting me, and I'm like, what did I do? I don't, I
Right.
don't, I don't understand that you're trying to share an emotion with me.
With
I'm
me.
just like,
Right. Right.
yeah.
You're like, what is
And
the
then,
logical, fact in this
yes.
situation? Interesting. And this is
And then
so
because of,
interesting as like,
yeah,
sorry, I just have to say
no,
this, like,
go.
as someone who's studying behavioral changes, that like that was what you were dealing with. Like that
Yeah.
is like, wow. Like to me, that's just so God would trying to like gently show you and like, in the kindest way of like, this is a, I guess, a quote unquote normal here human experience versus maybe a not as normal human experience. That's so interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And the only other thing I was going to say is like, not just I want to know if you're my boyfriend, not only do I want to know what I did, but then as
Right.
soon as you tell me that, I I was gaslighting before I knew what gaslighting was, right? I'm going to tell you why that's not why you should feel that way about whatever I did right, immediately. But
Right.
it wasn't even cool yet. I didn't know that's what I was doing. I was just so lost in my own suppression and selfishness that I wouldn't have even described as selfishness, but today I can see as selfishness. So yeah,
Wow.
that whole 20s was rough. And then this is the part where it like finally gets cool is I don't know really why I got to a point where like I had to be done. So I guess I should back up. In 2019, I finished the PhD. Lisa got minted a doctor of psychology. I wrote a 250-page dissertation on like people's beliefs about like body weight changeability and how that relates to eating and exercise behavior. I developed my
Wow.
own questionnaire related to that. So basically, if you like answer these 12 questions, I can put you into one of these 8 baskets and tell you what interventions might be most effective for you. Like all
Mm.
science, I'm going to figure this out. And I went straight from graduate school. I defended my dissertation, which is sort of like graduating,
Right.
in August of 2019. And the same month, I moved to Chicago to start a postdoctoral fellowship at the medical school at Northwestern in Chicago. So the
Wow.
medical school is downtown. So I moved to Chicago to work in a sort of similar thing, but for secondary cancer prevention. So it was like cancer. If you think of like someone who's had breast cancer and now is in remission, it
Right.
was how to develop mobile apps to help them stay in remission through like stress reduction, better eating behavior, better exercise behavior, alcohol reduction, right? All of the things that I can't do, but that I'm
Right.
an expert in on paper.
Wow. Yeah.
I like go to Northwestern to do that. And then moved there in September. And like, that was the first time in a long time. So the fun, I'm in air quotes again, thing about a PhD program is you don't have to show up that often. A lot of it is just writing on your own. And this was the first time where I really had to like show up from 9 to 5 to my office at the School of Medicine at Northwestern. And it was so hard with the way that I drank. Just,
Wow.
I didn't know that it was that hard to show up at 9 a.m. every day, but it was really hard to do that. And then, right as this is like starting to become impossible for me, and I don't know if my mentors were aware of what was going on or not. I almost think they had to be at least somewhat aware. Um, but COVID happened and I
Wow.
didn't have to show up to work anymore, and my job went remote. But that's when I had like basically no more responsibilities because we were still trying to work on papers, but a lot of like cancer patients obviously can't come in and do studies anymore because of COVID. They're the like most
Right.
vulnerable population. And
Right.
especially when it's not like a treatment for that they need today. It's just like, hey,
Right.
can we prevent your future cancer? They also want to prevent them from dying like in the present right now.
Right.
And that's when nobody knew what it was. And I don't even know if
Right.
we know today what it was, but that's when
Right.
everyone really didn't know what
No,
it
yeah.
was.
Right.
So they
Wow.
so I go home, and at the time, home was a studio apartment in Lincoln Park in Chicago. And that studio apartment quickly became like my prison, self-induced prison. In that I like my drinking just got so out of control without any responsibilities anymore. I don't know why I chose boxed wine. It's like, I don't know. It's gross, but I think it felt less problematic somehow than hard liquor. But
Right.
I would just buy like boxes and boxes of boxed wine and just drink it all the time. I was on like all of these dating apps, right? The two like main things that I use to soothe in this world are like male approval and alcohol. And I was just
Mm.
like one big mess of this. I was like going to people's houses, like on dates, just like I don't even know how many dates I went on during that time. Like just like to people's houses because you can't even meet in public. So like
Right. Right.
putting myself in danger. Obviously, my like sex conduct choices were far from how I would choose. I mean, even if I didn't have a husband, they would look nothing like the way
Right.
that I interact with that today. And my life just kind of like spiraled into this like big mess of like drunkenness and men. And I think it was the only way that I like knew how to be alive anymore.
Mm.
And my original sort of like rock bottom moment is I woke up. I don't even remember what I was doing the night before, but I woke up in my bed, and I had it on those sort of, those little like plastic things that you use in college to like make your bed taller. They're like,
Like the like standing block things
yeah,
that make, yeah, that like lift your
yeah.
bed. Yeah.
Yeah, so I had those so I could put storage under my bed because my apartment was so small. And I woke up and like one of them had slidden out. So I'm like, my bed's like at an angle, like because I like drunkenly smashed into it, right? And like the
Mm-hmm.
suitcase underneath it is smushed and like coming up through the bed. I
Right.
had my period, so there's like blood everywhere, and I'm a big peer when I don't pee my bed now, but when I'm drunk, I pee
Right.
the bed. So I've
Right.
like peed the bed. There's blood everywhere, and I like woke up and I was like, what, like, how did this happen? Not just like, how
Right.
did this happen today, but it was this moment of like, how did this, how is this what happened with my life?
Right.
And for some reason that day, I literally like packed a bag and just started driving back to Minneapolis. Like, all I knew is I like couldn't be in Chicago anymore. This is also the
Wow.
part where I'm like, not that I was making great decisions. So I moved back in with the cannabis boyfriend.
Okay.
Um, so not a boyfriend at the time, just like a friend. He's actually like still not really a close friend, like a check in once every couple months friend, but he's a
Right.
good human. And what was cool about that is during our whole relationship, it was pretty tumultuous. Um, like when we were actually dating, but he never commented on my drinking or rarely commented on my drinking back then because he's just, well, he's sort of like high all the time and just would like leave me alone.
Right. Right.
um so probably his own stuff is why he didn't comment on it.
Right. Right.
But once I moved back in, it had escalated so much that he was like, you can't be here if you're going to do this. Like, this is
Wow.
so far beyond anything that it was like before. Like, this is not what it's going to be. So that was probably like a month or two into me staying there. And naturally, my response to that, because it was Memorial Day weekend, was to just like get mad at him, pack a bag, and like there's a lake out here called Lake Minnetonka that everyone just like drinks on in the summer and
Mm-hmm.
boats. So I packed a bag and just like went off to Minnetonka to like go on a 5 day bender. In the middle of that weekend is when I got pulled over drunk and got just like let go.
Wow.
Um, and that Monday morning, so like basically I just like blacked out for 5 days. And that Monday morning, I woke up like at a house after a pool party. There's like empty cans everywhere. I don't remember what happened. I don't even know I'm there. I'm supposed to like be at a work meeting that I'm not on, like all of this stuff. And I went downstairs, and one of my friends was down there who drinks a lot too. Probably not as badly as I do, but he drank a lot. And he was pouring himself like a mug of white wine, which is a very normal behavior for me in the morning at this point. Like, I have no problem drinking a mug of wine at 8 a.m. if it'll make me feel better.
Right.
And he asked if I wanted one. And for the first time, like in my adulthood, I was like, I don't think so. And like that morning, like something changed. And I don't have a recollection of like praying or any, like, some people in their story, they're like, I prayed and then like
Right.
everything changed. I don't have a recollection of praying, but I know that something different happened that day.
Yeah.
Um, and I went home and I didn't drink. At home being, I went back to Dylan's couch.
Right.
And like he let me stay there and I just like sweat on the couch. Luckily, I guess I didn't need medical detox. It was a very bad few days. I like threw up a lot, sweat a lot. Like, I was pretty pickled at the point that I
Yeah.
was coming back.
Right.
Um, but that Thursday, I called a friend from college whose husband was in recovery, and he'd talked to me at a few different like friends' weddings that I'd been too drunk at over the course of my 20s, because he was sober that whole time and been like, hey, if you ever like, it's all up to you, but if you ever want help, like, let me know. So I called his wife, which was my friend from college, and she picks up, and from my recollection, I'm just like, hey, is Mike there? And she was like, yeah, we've been like waiting for this call. Which is when
Wow.
right? You're like, oh
Right.
no, I thought you guys all forgot that I didn't
Yeah.
know.
Like I thought
It's
you
gonna
guys
be
were concerned about
fine.
me anymore. I haven't heard from you. Yeah.
Yeah. And he told me to go to a meeting. And like I was like, oh, but I'm scared and this and that. And he was like, it's COVID. They're all on Zoom. Just find a recovery meeting on the internet and go to one. If you hate it, you can literally click leave and you'll never see any of those people again. And that is when my journey in recovery started. And one of the hardest things, which I've written about a little bit, is that you can find a way in recovery to avoid God. Um,
Wow.
I don't and it's hard because the thing that's crazy is I mean, not I think, I know that God is helpful for anyone's life. But at that moment, like of recovery, there are people in recovery who think that they don't need God. And my understanding of that is you're probably just not an alcoholic. And then they're just sort of living in this like mediocre life without God, right? They would benefit from God even if they're not an alcoholic, but then
Right.
God isn't the difference between them drinking and not drinking.
Right.
Um, and I found, I don't know if it's those people or I mostly found like there's this thing in probably in recovery, but it's also like in life and certainly on like Instagram, I see it too of this like cool to be angsty vibe of like
Mm-hmm.
my life was hard and like the cards weren't dealt in my favor and all of this
Yeah.
stuff.
Right.
And so I found those people in the rooms of recovery who were like, we do the universe, we don't do the God thing. And
Right.
like, you can just call it the universe and it'll be fine. And you just have to do the steps. And like, we all have anxiety and we're also on our like meds and whatever it is. It's like, I don't know, it's kind of almost cool. I have that in air quotes, but like, I don't know how to explain it. It's just this weird place that you can go. Um, and in the end, my understanding of recovery today is like it's a way to meet God. And one of the coolest things I've seen over the last 2 years is that like it's not the only way. And the more that I've spent time in church and in like Christianity, like people who are living out their faith are actually doing the 12 steps, whether they know it or not.
That's
Um,
so interesting.
right. They might not be doing it in order, but they're doing it. And I don't want to go too far out of this like linearity, but I was at a conference this weekend, like a Christian conference, and that one of the speakers was talking about we were like gonna pray for baptism of the Spirit. You can see I like struggle sometimes with like I'm like, what are the Bible words
Yeah, oh,
for
I know. I'm
this?
story of my life. I mean, I don't, it's not even about having the right words, you know?
Yeah. So I think it was baptism of the Holy Spirit, but essentially that like spiritual like experience, like in conscious contact with God.
Yeah.
And the guy said, I think these were the three things. The three things that would block it are faithlessness, so like not believing that it can happen, unforgiveness, and personal sin. And I'm
Mm,
like, faithlessness is literally steps 1, 2, and 3 of a 12-step recovery program. Um,
mm,
unforgiveness is step 4 and 5. Dealing with like the personal wrongs you've done to others is 6 through 9, and 10, 11, and 12 are just like this little repeat of 1 through 9. So it
yeah.
was this guy was saying essentially with 3 words, you have to do step 1 through 9 to have conscious contact with God.
Right. Wow.
So
That's
it's just so
wild.
cool, yeah, to see that like it's just kind of like spiritual kindergarten for people who never got taught how to have a relationship with God.
Yeah,
Um,
100%.
and that's what it's supposed to be, but it can also look like psychological homework. And that is what I did for the
Right.
first 7 months that I was in there, because it can look like write a list of people that you don't like when that's actually like write a list of people that you haven't forgiven. Right.
Right.
And those are two. And when you're in the psychology of it, it's like, I need to get the fact that I don't like these people off my chest.
Right.
Not, I need to figure out how to forgive these people who I resent.
Wow. That's
And you
so
can do it.
interesting.
Yeah. And you can do it either way. My experience of doing it the psychological way is I reached a new bottom sober, which was baffling to me. I thought that drugs and alcohol were my problem. I didn't think agnosticism was my problem, right?
Right.
It turns out agnosticism was my problem. Um,
Wow.
but I thought it was drugs and alcohol. So my first like meetings were June of 2020. And
Hmm.
then by this is December of 2020, I was at this point, I was still on all of my like meds. So I'm still taking anti-anxiety medications. I was on a ridiculous amount of ADHD medication, like Concerta and Ritalin that equaled like 70 something milligrams a day. If
Oh
anyone
my
takes meds for
gosh.
that, that's way too many. But I
Yeah.
lie when I go see psychiatrists and I get whatever I need in order to
Right.
continue to cope. So I'm on all these meds. Um, and like weird things that I don't do today, like kratom, which is like maybe not a drug, but like pretty much a drug, like just things that are not actually sobriety today. Um, and but I'm trying everything to cope, right? And
Right.
so I get to this point in December where I haven't drank since at this point it was July 5th. I had an alcoholic kombucha on July 4th of that year and was willing to admit that that was relapse. Um, but I hadn't drank other than that, but I'd been on all of these meds and like dabbled in some. I was trying to pretend mushrooms didn't count and some other things. Um, so there I am, basically like 6 months removed from alcohol, and I was having daily panic attacks. I was further in my eating disorder than I'd been in years. I was binging and vomiting on purpose. I mean,
Hmm.
it's out of a compulsion, but like not like, oh, I got food poisoning, binging and vomiting like
Right.
4 or 5 times a day, like spending my whole
Wow.
day binging and throwing up, which is probably producing some of the panic. I like
Right.
would try and plan my throwing up around when I was taking my meds so that I could experience the meds. Like, this is not a happy, joyous, and free life that was promised if I get sober, right? This is
Right.
almost worse than I'd rather just be blacked out all the time compared to what I was
Right.
experiencing in that.
Right.
Um, and in the way that God works, which is so poetic, that Christmas Eve night of that year, so it's COVID, so I didn't go back to Pennsylvania to see my family. I was alone in my apartment. I'd gone to a couple, I think, Zoom recovery meetings, and then had one of these like panicky overnight things. And someone had been telling me about this meeting for a long time that was in North Minneapolis, which is the like not great part of Minneapolis. And so I was like, I'm not going to go. It's in a weird part of town. It's also at 6:30 in the morning. I don't wake up that early. It's in a weird part
Yeah.
of town. But I had this like overnight panic thing, so I went because because like what else was I gonna do? So I'm already awake, so I drive to this. So now it's Christmas morning, 6:30 a.m. Christmas morning. I'm like, do they even have meetings on Christmas Day? Whatever. I'm in this weird part of town. It's dark because it's winter in Minnesota. And I walk in, and it was like finally the experience of I'd found a meeting that what I know today is most of the people in that meeting knew God or were trying to seek him, right? Like maybe a
Wow.
third of the meeting were people who like had a strong faith. A third of the people were working with those people, were like active sponsees of those people. And then a third of the people were there because they're open-minded to a meeting where people have that much faith. And I could just feel it in the room. And I didn't know that it was faith, but I knew that these people were laughing a lot more. They didn't have that anxiety is cool thing. None of
Right.
this was different. And they had a breakfast afterward, and they had announced it at the meeting. And of course, in my own self-centeredness, I'm like, oh, the breakfast is not for me. And
Yeah.
this guy, the guy who was beside me, elbowed me when they like gave the announcement, and he was like, you should come to that. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm invited to that. um and that man ends up being the best man at my wedding, so which is
Oh my
cute.
gosh.
And he gave a medallion to a guy whose sobriety date was Christmas Day, who talked all about God the whole time. And that man is
Wow.
my husband.
Oh my gosh, I
So
have chills.
a lot of things were happening that morning that I did not know about yet.
Wow.
So I go to this breakfast and sit across from who I do not yet know is I'm going to marry him in about 3 years. Um, and the first thing I sit down, and he's like, just really a strong faith and just like lets the Holy Spirit like speak through him. Although I never would have known that at the time. And I sit down and he goes, how old were you when your parents got divorced? And I'm
Uh,
like, good morning to you too. Merry Christmas. Like, what is
yeah.
happening here? And I was like, I don't really see how that's relevant. Like, I'm not, I'm over it. It doesn't matter. And he was like, okay, seems that way.
Oh
And
my
it's just
gosh.
like, right, but he's trying to like unravel, like, what is wrong with
Right.
you? Why are you in so much pain?
Right.
And within a very short period of time, he basically got me to see that the way that I was living life wasn't working, and that it wasn't about sobriety or not sobriety. It wasn't about all these other things. It was about like, I don't know what it means to be a human, because it turns out that to be a human is to be connected with my creator, but I didn't believe that my creator existed. So how am I going to do that?
Right.
And
Wow.
he got me. I could tell that he was like full of joy, this whole thing. And I'm like, I need to know your secret. Like, what are you doing? How do you pray? What do you, because I'm open to prayer, but it's like prayer to the universe and my imaginary
Right.
friends, right?
Right. Right.
How do you pray? And he said, I'll show you. And this man, we get in his car, and I'm like, oh, it's like kind of fun. Male approval, right?
Right.
And we drive, and we park outside a church. And we walk inside, and he was taking me to a daily mass, like a Catholic daytime old people mass. And we walk in, and I've never even really been in a Catholic church before. I have zero clue what's going on.
Right.
And we like sit down, and I'm like, what are we doing here? And he was like, this is what I do. And I turned to him and I'm like, Catholicism is your big effing secret, except I did not say effing.
Yeah.
And he was like, just sit down. And I like do the mass. It's terrifying to go to mass if you've never gone to mass before, because everyone knows what they're saying and you have no idea what you're saying, which is very
Yeah.
confusing. Um, and in the end, it was obviously mass was not the secret. Jesus was the secret.
Right.
Um, and so that was like the beginning of, I went into a church. I prayed on my knees for the first time, like hanging under a cross, and like
Hmm.
basically said like, okay, I surrender to like actually God, for the first time. And I used to call it Bible God, as if there's other ones.
Yeah.
But I surrendered to God, and it is wild from that point how quickly my entire life changed. Like, so it's not sobriety, right? I had like been mostly sober. And
Yeah.
in that very short time, the big difference was like, instead of just having done the homework, I like saw that sheet for the first time as like a list of people that I had decided not to forgive, a list of people that like I was in the sin of wrath, right? Like, it's actually, I need forgiveness for the fact that I resent them all, which is crazy and not how I thought about life before.
Right. Wow.
So it was this really cool thing where I'd heard people say like the grace of God. And I'm like, what is the grace of God? And I started praying. There's this like specific prayer that we use in recovery. I think I've put it in some of the essays, but about resentment. And I started praying that prayer, and I like got the experience of no longer like having violent feelings toward these people that were on the list. Like they were just like, okay. And it was crazy because I don't even really, like, I prayed, but I sort of didn't even really believe that God existed yet. And I'm like, this is
Right.
nuts. How do I not hate these people anymore? And he kept being like, it's God. Like, God is
Yeah.
doing that. That is how you're
Wow.
doing this. Like that's what it is. And that was the beginning of this like huge transformation. That happened really quickly. And I struggle sometimes with like the Instagram thing online, because I try to be really inclusive and careful, because I know how slow I was to warm up to like moving from the universe to God to like, but like I couldn't forgive those people without Jesus. And
Right.
it's a balance, because I know that if I just like lead with Jesus in recovery, I would not have followed myself on Instagram, right? Like, I wouldn't have even stayed for the party. I would have just been like,
Mm.
this girl's nuts. I want nothing to do with it. And at the same time, like, yes, when praying to God and knowing that secretly knowing in the back of your head that it's a Christian God. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It's
Right.
like, before I was willing to even say the word Jesus, I sort of knew that he was like part of the deal that I had signed up for when I started calling it God and prayed under that cross.
Right.
But there is a difference about when I was finally willing to like have like Abba Father as my father, to like go to Jesus for forgiveness, to like be filled with the Holy Spirit when and like know that that's like what's inspiring me in the world.
Right.
That has brought a new peace and a new joy that's at like a fully different level than
Right.
when I just said God. But then I also don't want to like scare people away. So I do have this like funny balance, which is cool to be on this podcast and just be like, I need Jesus. That's the whole deal. But I am careful about how I communicate that,
Yeah.
um,
A hundred
which has
percent.
been an interesting journey. But yeah, so that's like really when all of that changed. And what is so cool is when we were talking about like emotions, is what I see today is like, it is okay to like have resentment. It's just, I need to go to God for forgiveness for that. So like
Right.
pretending I didn't resent my parents for getting divorced was actually me like holding this deeply seated anger, right? Like, that
Right.
was actually not useful. I just admitting like, wow, I'm so resentful toward them, but I just need to go to God and like get forgiveness for that. And for me, I also go to God. I don't feel like my human power can just like forgive people when I'm really mad at them. I feel like that's a mind game.
Right.
Um, but like going to God and asking for help to forgive, like going back and realizing like I had resentment toward John's mom for murdering him, right? I had resentment toward
Right.
John for being dead. I had resentment toward, I've actually had this really interesting experience recently of a guy that I was friends with in grad school who I met at this like grad school summer camp thing. Shortly after that summer camp, he lived in Colorado. He got murdered in like a bar
Oh my
situation,
gosh.
like stabbed to death. And that's another one I just like fully dissociated um, until like the last few months, which is what is so weird. And I don't even remember if um, like his murderer was on my original thing. And I shouldn't actually even call him his murderer. So I internalized it as like, this guy murdered my friend. He's bad. I don't read up like before God, right? I have no capacity of forgiveness, of understanding, of
Right.
anything. And recently the guy just like I couldn't even remember his name, but I was like, I know if I Google this, it'll pop up. Um, and he just like kept coming up in prayer, and I would be like, okay, like I know at this point in my life, like forgive him. He knows not what he does. I need God's help to do that. Like the
Mm-hmm.
whole thing. And so I'd pray about that. And then one day I finally Googled it, and I can't remember the whole story, but the guy was acquitted. Like it was this like crazy situation where like my friend had actually like, I think started the fight. I don't want to misrepresent the news.
Wow.
I don't know who's paying attention to it anyway, but like
Right.
and it just shows me like the delusions that resentment can bring me to. That so much
Wow.
of the things that I resent in this world, like probably I know looking back, they didn't even happen. Like how I twisted, like I had an abusive
Wow.
boyfriend were like things I used to think of. And it's like a lot of that was caused by me. Sometimes I don't ever want to say all because there's always two people, but sometimes a lot more than half of that was caused by me, where I used to
Right.
say, like, well, I was in this abusive relationship. And I know there are people who are like in ones where it like really is the other person. But almost always it's both of us. And even ones where it is more the other person, it's asking myself, like, what is it in me that needed to be in that situation? Even if it's like, well, I needed money. It's like, okay, then I didn't know that I had a God that could, like provide for me in that way. So it's not to blame
Right.
myself for that, but to just look honestly at like, okay, well, then I stayed in that relationship where someone was treating me poorly because I needed money or because of whatever it was. And to just
Right.
see like, my part in so much of that. Another one that was huge for me that I know ruffles some feathers. So if you need to edit it out, you can. But
Yeah.
but it was big for me. And you can even leave out me saying that you edited it out if you leave it in. Um, but is all of these experiences of like things that I thought were sexual assault, especially while I was
Mm.
drinking, of places that I woke up, of things that I even maybe like reached a level of rape, is that like, what is my role in that? And it's so opposite of society tells me dress however you want, drink however you want, whatever, this shouldn't happen to you. And
Right.
like, I want to be clear, that is true, right?
Yeah.
Dress however you want, drink however you want, that should not happen to you. That is true.
Right.
However, I did all those things. I dressed in a way, I drank in a way, right? And so then to be able to like have ownership over that and to be like, I dressed this way and I put myself in that situation and I dressed that way because I wanted attention from men. Did I want attention from men at that level? No. Do they need to go to God and confess their rape or their assault too? Absolutely. But like
Right.
so much healing came from understanding that like if I'm not doing the things that I was doing, going the places I was going, seeking the approval I was seeking, that like I'm not going to end up being in those situations at all,
Right.
was
Wow.
like huge for me. And it's so much of, I feel like this relationship like with God has just opened my eyes to see that like just because someone else like they're wrong too, but I might still be wrong, if
Right.
that makes sense.
Oh, 100%. It just speaks to like the victimhood mentality. And like there is something so freeing over taking ownership of your part in behavior. Like you said, like it's not always just happening, like things aren't always just happening to us. Like we have more control in our reaction or in our behavior or in our attitude than we think. That's so
Yeah.
profound, Lisa.
Yeah.
But
So that was really big. This other actually really big lesson, I kind of skipped, but it's related to my parents' divorce. It was like the
yeah,
first place that I really saw it, which is confusion leading to anger. And looking back over my life and finding times where maybe I'm not willing to admit that I was angry or that I have resentment, but I know that there was confusion there. And what's so big about that is that confusion, if you just leave it over time, you end up with anger. And the first time someone told me that, I was like, I don't even understand what you're talking about. And my sponsor was like, okay, think of the last time that you lost your car keys. You like at first you lose them and you're like, oh, like where are they? You start with confusion. In 5 seconds, you're like, where are my freaking car keys? This is
yeah,
crazy. Who stole
right,
them? What's happening? And it's like
yeah,
that same thing. If it starts with like, I never asked my parents why they got divorced, or like, I don't understand why this person died, or I don't understand why I'm being treated this way. I don't understand why I didn't get that promotion. I don't understand why they don't want to be friends with me. That if I just leave that as like, I'm confused, there's no healing in that. But to see that, like, that confusion, if I don't resolve it, is actually anger. But anger I can bring to God.
wow. That's so interesting because the enemy is like one of his ways of being known as the author of confusion. And so,
Mm-hmm.
like, when you connect that point to it, like, him being able to, he can manipulate something that isn't clear, something that doesn't have clarity behind it. So, like, not addressing something that's confusing you is like opening a door to him to, like, put a label on it because you hadn't found clarity within that circumstance yet. That's wild. I've never heard
Yeah.
that before. Wow.
Yeah. So that confusion thing was really big for me. But there's just been so many like little lessons like that that have just opened the door to like, I guess I didn't realize that like being living in peace isn't about like finding something that would make me happy or living in the right house or living in the right job or having all of these things, but it's just like how it's almost like the absence of like the negative, right? Like
Right.
I don't even know like that there are like I've joked recently that I'm like if you told me 3 years ago that this would be my life today, I don't think I would want it. Like I don't think I would
Right.
get it. Like I don't
Right.
it doesn't make any sense that like 3 years ago, like yes, I was like miserable and I had all these eating disorders. Like what I would have liked about my life today is I don't even know if I would have liked that I don't drink or use drugs anymore. I feel like I would have been confused by that one. But I
Yeah.
would have liked that like I don't have anxiety, I don't have depression anymore. I don't have any of the eating disorders I used to have, right? Like my brain is not filled with thoughts of like my body image all day long. Like I would
Yeah.
have liked those things. But then if you were like I mean, I think I would have liked that I was married, but if I look at the men that I dated before, like on paper,
Right.
right? The people that God didn't have for me, they like own businesses, they're entrepreneurs, they're like this and that and the other thing. And my husband today, like, has a really long record and graduated from only high school, right? Like, there's these
Right.
things that I'm like, that's the husband that I was like meant to have for this whole time.
Right.
So like that's really funny. Or like I went from Northwestern School of Medicine to I was working at like a tech company out of San Francisco for a while. That looks like what I thought I would have wanted. And then
Right.
now I'm like, I don't really know. I wrote a book that a publisher will hopefully publish. That's new news.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
but
so
yeah, so
fun.
it's with a publisher. Hopefully we'll hear back from them soon. And like I have an Instagram and we're like trying to I don't know who we is like me and my other personalities me and maybe my husband helps me sometimes
Yeah.
um, we are like maybe trying to start like some little like online school thing but like
Oh, I love
my
it.
job doesn't look like I thought my like husband doesn't look like I like all of these things don't look like that but it's just like God leads us in these places that like don't make sense but like it's the peace and the joy of like my life today that I'm like I know this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm like sometimes I'm like God, could you just show me the destination? Like
Yeah.
what is happening here?
Right.
Um
100%.
but it's like it's so fun. Like I literally the other day and when thoughts from the enemy come like the other day I had this thought where I was like, well if I had a tech job the last year we're like looking at houses, like I'd have 100 grand more to like put into a house right now. And then it's like that, then it would have been the wrong house, right? Like that is
Right.
not the journey that I'm on.
Right. Wow.
And to have like peace about that, that I would have, like, if I had done that, if I'd not followed God's will, right, and I just like go back and get that tech job again, and then I have that money, then I would like end up in the wrong house, and then like there's, and God uses everything for good, right? So I would have ended up with lessons about what that looks like, but that I can just like see that through of like that's not, for whatever reason, the path that I'm supposed to be on right now. And just God's will is like, it doesn't, I can't tell that I'm in it for myself or anyone else by what it looks like on the outside. It's
Right.
always just by that like peace that surpasses all knowledge on the inside.
Wow. Yeah, that's so good. It's so crazy how we create these ideals for ourselves and we think we know what's best for ourselves, but there is nothing comparable to the peace that you have when you know you're being obedient and just being like, all right, I know this feels like the craziest thing I could ever possibly do right now, but this is obedience. And you step into that, and sometimes it takes a second, but peace just comes. Even
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of the most quote unquote unreliable circumstances, or what might seem like stupid or dumb, or just like, what am I even doing right now? Like, kind of like what I was telling you earlier, like, why am I even starting a podcast? Like, I don't know what I'm doing, but there's something in that. And just listening to you speak, it's like, I have this peace over me because I'm like, this is why. Because I'm giving someone like you who has this profound story to like share and to encourage someone who's walked through something similar. Like, the peace that follows obedience is wild. And not that the Lord says you have to be obedient first. He says the opposite. He says, come to me, I have grace for you. But
Mm-hmm.
it's wild what obedience results in. And the peace of mind, the peace of mind isn't, it's not comparable to anything. There's nothing, no money amount, no worldly success that could compare to that.
Yeah, none of that. And none of the million other things I tried.
Right, right. I'm
The way that
so
I feel at the end of a yoga class does not compare to the peace of God. It just like literally does not.
Yeah, and I feel like we've all tried to even like within me navigating my relationship with the Lord, I've even sought those things, just in addition to, I'm like, okay, well maybe I can like this can be quote unquote supplemental for me in my faith, but it's like, no, Christ stands alone. Like Jesus is
Hmm.
the way. And like you were saying before, there's some things that you can do like the red light and whatever that can be healthy, so to speak, for your body, but it's not the way. It's the
Yeah,
Lord that's the way. And it's crazy how when you finally surrender everything, what he can do with that. It's nuts. Your whole testimony is literally that. Just the
yeah,
complete surrender. And it's wild too how we like even in those moments where you're just speaking, I'm thinking like you're speaking on thinking that drugs are the problem or alcohol is the problem. And the Lord's just like, those are consequences of the root problem, which is not
yes,
having me. And that was profound to me. Like that just, I mean, that was crazy.
yes. The other thing you just made me think of is like the root problem. I got really stuck in solving physical problems with
Yeah.
like God, with not God. And that's been a harder, I think, like mental journey for me to accept. So, like, I mean, things as simple as, like, I had my whole watch me be like, ah, I had bulimia, but I had digestive issues. So, like, obviously, right? In a
Right.
weird way, like, the root of that is I have no God. So then I'm vomiting all the time. So then I have digestive issues. But
Right.
bulimia is so weird in that I would go through like a few months where it was really bad. And then I would have like 6 months, 8 months, right? Where I like wasn't doing it at all. Um,
Right.
like I started anorexic, like went to like 88 pounds anorexic early on.
Wow.
So, which is, oh my gosh, I can't do mental math. I'm like 40 pounds probably less than I weigh now. I know I'm in like a little box, so you can't really like see. But I'm 5'6".
Right.
So,
Wow.
so I was like clearly in a big problem. But so there was a lot of physical consequences to not just the eating disorders, but like I used to have all of these like reasons for them. So in 20, I think it was 15 or 16, I got diagnosed with alopecia areata. So I had six large bald spots on my head that they couldn't explain.
Wow.
Um, I had like IBS, which basically means nothing, irritable bowel syndrome. It's like, oh, you
Hmm.
can't digest food. We're not really sure why. They did an endoscopy to see if I needed to be gluten free. I've tried like every single diet thing to try to like solve my weight issues, solve weight issues just being the ones in my head. I've never even been overweight. But like everything, right? And there's all of these. I used to have a list somewhere of like the physical stuff, but it is so wild to see like I don't have any diet restrictions today, right? Like
Wow.
I'm not lactose intolerant, I'm not gluten free, I'm not like all of these things that I like thought were the solution to like why I wasn't feeling good have nothing to do with anything. Like God, I guess wants me to eat ice cream. Like it's all
Right.
fine.
Right. I mean, that speaks volumes. If you could tell your pre-Christ self one thing when you were in your exploring your spiritual era, trying to figure out, what's the solution here? You said you were using crystals, you said you were dabbling in all the different things, yoga. You could probably name a few more. If you could tell yourself one thing at that point in time that you think you would have been able to receive to point you in the way, what would that be?
People ask me this actually more than you think. It's a great question. People ask me this all the time. I was so full of self that I don't think anything. Like in a funny way,
Wow.
um, the pain just had to be enough. It because I mean people tried, right? People when you're in that state, people are like, "Hey, do you want to like come to church?" And I'm like, "No, I don't do that." Right? Like
Right.
those are the things, but I mean, it's funny because some of the things that really have hit me over like the course of time have actually not been things that direct me to the way, but things that woke me up to who I was, I guess. Like if I
Interesting.
think back to that thing that Kevin said about like, how old were you when your parents got divorced? And I'm like, what does that have to do with it? And he's like, you look like someone who's angry, right? And being like,
Right.
I look like someone who's angry? What do you mean I
Yeah.
look like someone who's angry?
Agree.
I
Yeah.
thought it was fine.
Yeah. I didn't think I looked that
um,
way.
yeah, but I don't think that anything like about, which is so interesting for like, if I think about myself today and like, what does evangelism look like? Or what is, you know what I
Right.
mean? That it's
Right.
almost like, I don't know that I could have even heard anything. Like I think back to like, what if someone asked me like, hey, can I pray with you? Like when I hear people who are like really open to the spirit, just like moving them in public and they like walk up to people in the grocery store and are like, hey, can I pray with you? I so didn't think that I had any problems. Oh, look at
I
that.
know. The
Fireworks.
fireworks again.
Yeah, I so didn't think I had any problems, even though I had so many that like I just don't even know. I just had to hit rock bottom. But the things that I feel like stick out to me are the ones where people were honest with me about what they were
Mm,
witnessing. And I think that's
wow.
maybe something to like take is that if you have a friend who you like know is struggling or a family member or someone that you know who's struggling, like it's not I don't think it's helpful. It would have been helpful to me to go to them and be like, "Hey, I think you really need God." Right? You're not
Right.
wrong. They absolutely do. But like
Yeah.
that's not to just be like, hey, like you look angry, which they probably won't receive well, but they'll remember you. So that's the
Right.
problem too, is sometimes being like a tool, and maybe it's not you look angry, but like, hey, it looks like something's really wrong, or like, how are things
Yeah.
going?
Yeah.
But you don't want to be in that place where you're like diving into their self pity with them because then it
Right.
just like kind of takes you down. So that's why I'm like, I don't know, almost nothing. Just pray and hope that the spirit moves you in some way. We have this saying in my recovery home group, which kind of highlights this.
Right.
Um, but it's vodka will bring you back, which is kind of like there's not a lot to say. You just have to drink until you're done drinking. You just have to, like seek men until you're done seeking men. You have to gamble till you're done gambling. And that like
Yeah.
that feeling of what it feels like when you've like drank so much vodka that you can't drink anymore, that's what will bring you back to God.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
which is obviously, if there's people whose like children are suffering with alcoholism, that's not what you want to hear. You're like, tell me the word, tell me the thing that I
Right.
say that will
Right.
like open them up to this. But I think that's the hardest part. And the other thing is like the their journey is their journey, and the most loving thing you can do sometimes is just like let somebody live that out, as long as you're being honest about like what you're witnessing. I think that's actually probably the best thing. And if I think about how I sponsor a lot of women today, like usually between like, I try to not get more than like 12, but I just
Yeah.
love helping people. But like 8 to
That's so
12 at a
sweet.
time, right? And this is
Yeah.
this is not my job. This is for free on nights and weekends, just sitting
Right.
down, and it's an hour a week with each person. So,
Wow.
it's a lot of time. But to just like the most loving thing that I can do is when they walk in the door and I'm like, "How's your week?" And they're like, "It was fine." And I'm like, "It was definitely not based on how you look right now." Right? And then they can kind of like open up from there.
Wow. Yeah.
Um yeah, and I feel like that's really the only way to, or like there were so many times where I thought that people didn't realize that like my drinking was that bad because they didn't say anything. And it's
Mm.
hard to be that friend, but if someone had come up to me and been like, "Hey, no judgment, but like you were so drunk last night." Right? And because I
Yeah.
thought if you didn't say anything, nobody knew. I'm like, "Ah, I
Right.
got away with it again," when the whole time
Right.
it's other people being like, "How do we even say this to her? She's going to get mad at me. I don't want her to be mad at me." But I mean, luckily I'm in a place today where I don't mind if people are mad at me, but
Right.
it would have been really hard back then. And it's really hard with like someone who's a friend and not just someone that you're trying to like sponsor or mentor or
Right.
whatever that is. But
Oh,
yeah, I mean, it's funny
absolutely.
to say honesty is the best policy and listening to God is the best policy, but God gives me words sometimes that I'm like, "Oh, do I have to be the one to deliver that? Can you
Oh,
have someone else deliver that? Does that have to be
yeah. Right. You're like you're gonna put me in this position? He's like, yep.
me?"
So
Yeah.
if you, to me, as you're speaking, and that being your response, like, you wouldn't have been able to like hear anything all that helpful outside of just the honest truth. What would you, it's always hard to say this, but would you have it on any other way, your story? If you could have had it any other way, are you like, this pain was all worth it, this suffering was all worth it, where this put me was all worth it? How do you feel about that?
Yeah. It's interesting. I try not to think too hard these days because I know that my own thinking is what gets me into trouble.
That's fair.
Um, yeah, if I think too hard, I can think my way into like, well, did this little piece have to happen this way, right? Or did I have to hurt
Right.
this? The places that I go back to where it's hardest is like, did I have to hurt? It's less when people hurt me that
Hmm.
I'm all pretty much okay with today, but where I hurt others,
Yeah.
I think is the hardest pieces to get through. But what's interesting about the dichotomy of those two is that if today I look at the people that hurt me as gifts of how to get closer to God, and yet I'm still stuck in how I hurt others, that if I can just allow them to have their own experience and hope
Right.
that however I hurt them, that if that when they get to have the experience of like, oh my gosh, I can forgive Lisa with God's help,
Wow.
right? And then
Yeah.
they get to have that experience that I'm having where I'm like, that's okay that they harmed me because now I understand that they didn't know what they were doing, and I get to use that to help other people. So that two-sided thing has helped me a lot. And then in terms of just like the breadth of like what I did, what happened, mentorship or sponsorship, whatever you want to call it, of other people, has really changed what those things mean to me. So some of the things that I was most like, here's another thing. I have no idea where this comes from, so someone can tell me I'm wrong, and that's fine. But one of the things I learned, oh, look at the thumbs up, learned in a meeting once is that like guilt is not a feeling. I actually, there's like so many comments on this essay, I can't even believe it. But it was super early on. I had like 500 followers, but it has like 1,000 likes. Like everyone
Mm-hmm.
on who cares about this kind of stuff read that one. It's called
Yeah.
Guilt is Not a Feeling. And the idea
Mm-hmm.
behind it is that you're either guilty or not guilty, right? If you feel
Mm-hmm.
guilty, you're guilty of something. My husband likes to explain it as, because he's been in court a lot. He's like, when you go to court, the judge isn't like, how are you feeling today? And you're like, oh, I feel a little guilty over here, not guilty over here.
Yeah.
It's like,
Right.
are you guilty or not guilty? And spiritually,
Mm.
what happens when we're living in guilt, so living in essentially denial of guilt because we're not willing to bring it to God, what happens is
Mm.
shame, remorse, and regret. So, like,
Mm.
when I'm experiencing shame, remorse, or regret about the past, it probably means that I haven't brought it to God yet for forgiveness.
Mm. That's really good.
So that's been like the thing is whenever shame, remorse, or regret about the past comes up, it's like, what am I guilty of that I'm not willing to bring to God? And it might not be the most obvious thing, right? So it's like
Right.
if I used to shoplift a lot when I was a teenager. Um, Part of one of the million things I've confessed at this point. But like having shame around that was was because I was guilty of it and not willing to bring it to God for maybe didn't even know God existed right in the beginning. That's why I feel shame
Right.
about it. But then once he exists to bring it to him for forgiveness, but then I might still be guilty of like underlying selfishness, right? Or the need for approval. That's the reason that I was stealing this stuff, or just straight
Right.
greed if I wanted to resell it. So that's what I mean by like, it's not always obvious. Like, sure, I've confessed the like literal being a thief, but like, have I really confessed like the stuff that's underneath it and the selfishness of like, I stole this stuff because I wanted to be included and my parents wouldn't buy me $200 jeans. So I bought them myself for free, right?
Right.
Like, but that's actually like selfishness and need for approval from others and caring what other people think and all these other
Wow.
pieces that I was guilty
Wow.
of. So sometimes the shame, remorse, and regret can stick around because of these like other pieces of things. So, like,
Right.
big picture, that's all to say, even the like worst of my past experiences, I get to sit across from women I mostly have them meet them at my house, like at my kitchen island, um, and tell them that no matter what they did, it's going to be okay. And
Yeah.
like that's the coolest piece of like when I think of like why did I have to go down this rabbit hole or that rabbit hole or whatever that is, that it's like whatever it is, like I did a version of it too. And I think that's I'm gonna be like that's the coolest thing about sin. Which sounds crazy to say that's the coolest thing
Right.
about sin, but even if I didn't, like that's the cool thing about like the seven deadlies, let's say, is that
Mm-hmm.
even if my greed didn't manifest like your greed, if you're sitting across from me, like I know what it feels like to be greedy.
Right.
Maybe if
Right.
my envy didn't manifest like your envy, but I still know what it's like to like suffer from envy, that like
Right.
chronic pain of needing others' belongings, and then to bring
Right.
that to God. So that's the like cool thing is to when I start to understand that like that's the gift of just being like I'm just a sinner, right? Is that then when I sit
Right.
across from people, like even my husband Swansea, who I drove to church with us the other day, he was like, "You drive, Nick," and I was like, "Oh, good." And we were talking through stuff, and even with him, right, it doesn't I only sponsor women in my regular life for a number of reasons, but even with him he was struggling with some stuff, and to just be able to like have this back and forth of being like I've been there and it's okay, or I've been on the flip side of that because it's male female relationships, right, and like
Right.
here's what I got out of that,
Right.
and it's all going to be okay. And that's the biggest thing, is that like no matter how bad it got, God can use it for good.
Right. That's the power. Yeah, it's like exactly what you were saying. And just to reiterate, like that is literally the Lord using bad for good. Like that is the Lord taking what we think is our weakest moments or the worst parts about us, our sin, and literally like transforming it and using it for good. Like that's so powerful.
Yeah. And if you don't have people who have been there, you don't have, right? Like it just starts with like, if you don't have someone who is an alcoholic, right, then you're not going to
Right.
believe them when you say God takes that
Right.
away. But if you
Right.
don't have someone who suffered from whatever else, but when I sit there and I'm like, no, I did that. And like truly it doesn't, because that's when I know it's like really forgiven, is when it just doesn't come to mind. It doesn't come, it's like forgive and forget, right? It, God
Right.
doesn't keep a record. It, the only time that things, there used to be things that just tortured me, right? They would pop up all the time. I can't believe you slept with him. You did this, you did that, you blah, 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 all the time. Right.
Yeah.
And then like once I go to God with that stuff, the only time it doesn't pop up in my head at random, the only time it comes back is when it's being used for good, is when I'm sitting across from another girl.
Right.
It'll suddenly pop into my mind and I'm like, oh, I did that too.
Right.
But I don't like
Right.
walk around the world worrying about the fact that I like did all of those things. So
Right.
it can be really hard though from the outside though. Like if someone who hasn't had that grace is listening, they're like, she doesn't even care that she like did all of those horrible things. And it's like, no, it's not that. It's just I can't undo them. So given that I
Right.
can't undo them, how can God use those things so that like the next over the last 3 years I've probably sponsored, I don't know, like 20, 30 people, right? Those are 20, 30 people who are now not in the world committing all those sins. I mean, for the most part, we
Right.
all still sin, but I mean, like the major ones, we're not like, stealing thousands of dollars of clothes anymore from stores and like things
Right.
like that.
Right. Right.
We're not like blowing up relationships in major ways. It's not like I have a perfect relationship with my husband, but it's not, we like, whatever stupid things like, why'd you make that
Right.
joke? But it's not like
Right.
cheating on each other like it did before. So
Right.
it's just like that's the gift of that, is just that by having that history, when I share it with the next person, they can go to God, they can, like have their experience, and now they're not doing that. And then if that, like, that's evangelism at its best, right? If that could just like expand at double speed, we'd actually like have a much happier, more peaceful, whatever world. Unfortunately,
Mm.
it's like a pretty slow process, but
Oh, 100%. And it's just the power in community too.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. Like your vulnerability just goes to show how much strength you have in the Lord. Like it truly, like no one would be so open about all of those things if they didn't have the strength of the Lord. Like it literally takes relationship with him to be that just both emotionally honest and
Yeah.
factually honest. And you did both. Like that is your story is so profound, and that's a hard thing to do, to just kind of like lay your story out on the line for an opportunity for someone to just relate and feel like they're being seen and hopefully being pointed to Christ. Because although your story is crazy, so many people have crazy stories. I feel like my story is
Mm-hmm.
also crazy in my own way. Like we all find Christ in the most profound ways, but someone I just pray that someone hears your story and is like, oh my gosh, like you were saying with your with your sponsors, is that how you say it?
Fancies, yeah.
Sponsees, with your sponsees, like I hope someone can have that same moment just listening to this and being like, okay, I haven't hit a point so low that like the Lord isn't able to redeem it. Like that is the whole point of the Lord. Thank you so much for coming on
Yeah.
here and just being so honest. You put in so much wisdom. Like I'm so grateful for you. It makes total sense why the Lord put this on my heart so long ago. And yeah, I'm could not be happier. Like I don't
Yay.
know. Like this is just like you this was the biggest gift. I don't even have the words. I don't even have the follow up. I feel like I truly sat in as an audience member on this. And so thank you so much.
Yeah, this is so great. I do want to say one thing for anyone listening. I can't promise this forever, but at least as of today, I have never not replied to a DM. Every DM that I get, I have replied to, because people are usually reaching out because they like want help with God or with
Yeah.
sobriety or with anything. So if you're listening, and you want to reach out, I'm sure my Instagram won't be hard to find somewhere in here. But reach out
Yes.
and send a DM. People are always afraid to bother me. Do not be afraid to bother me. If you want to talk about God or you want to talk about sobriety, don't be afraid to bother me. You're not bothering me.
Oh, that's so sweet. I will definitely like put your Instagram handle in the captions and whatever, and I'll make sure that it's an easy way to find your information. But
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you so much, and everyone have a great